Hello, everyone. I'm Marina Kaczynski, and I'm an art faculty member at the College of DuPage. Welcome to the first artist presentation of 2022 of our Visiting Artist Series. The Visiting Artist Series is a collaboration between Cleve Carney Museum of Art, Fine Art, Photography, and Architecture programs at the College of DuPage. And I'd like to thank Multimedia Services for producing our virtual series. As a reminder, all of our events are archived on the Cleve Carney Museum of Art website. Today, we are very fortunate to have Emily Schroeder Willis give a lecture about her work. Emily Schroeder Willis received her BFA from the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and her MFA from the University of Colorado Boulder. She has been an artist in residence and visiting artist at the Archie Bray Foundation, the Zentrum for Keramik in Berlin, the Alberta College of Art and Design, and Watershed Center for the Ceramic Arts. Her work has been exhibited in the DuPage Design Fair, the Kansas City Museum, the Ohio Craft Museum, the Ralph Arnold Gallery, and many others. Currently, she lives in Chicago, where she is a faculty member at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Please join me in welcoming Emily Schroeder Willis.
Thank you so much for having me to share my work with you today. So again, like Marina said, my name is Emily Schroeder Willis, and I'm really excited to talk with you today about my work. So at the moment, I live in Chicago, and I have been teaching at the Art Institute for the past 7 years. I grew up in Minnesota, and there are a lot of things that I feel like have made their mark on me, but probably the three that stand out the most are Warren Mckenzie, who we see up here in the upper left-hand corner. And they were a potter that I would say really brought what we would consider ceramics or traditional pottery ceramics to the United States. And Warren lived in Stillwater, Minnesota, about 25 minutes from where I grew up. And when I was in high school, we would oftentimes go there to see his pots, touch them, handle the work. I kind of got to have this life, a little viewpoint into seeing the life of a potter and kind of this romanticized life of what that was. I would also say that growing up in Minnesota, there was this minimalist Scandinavian aesthetic, this idea of less is more, that was also very influential in the home that I grew up, and then in just kind of the surroundings around there at that time, and then also the Minnesota landscape and this need to be surrounded by water and this green space. So I went to the University of Minnesota, like Marina said. At that time, I was interested in atmospheric firing kilns, soda kilns specifically, and I was interested in incorporating some of the architectural elements in the surfaces of my work. I actually, when I began at the university, I had been working on throwing on the wheel and making fairly traditional pottery forms, and then slowly switched over, actually I should say rapidly switched over to hand building when I was developing some wrist problems and I was having tendonitis. And so I had to figure out an alternative way of working that was beyond just throwing. So I switched to a coiling and pinching method of my work. So these are pieces from undergrad. At that school, I had three, again, two people that were very influential to me. One was Mark Ferris, who was one of the faculty members there. His work is in the upper left-hand corner. And then Margaret Bowles, who's in the right-hand corner, making these pinched condiment sets. And then there's a piece of Warren's there. So I feel like all three of these people had a significant influence to me and my work and how I was thinking about things. Mark, with really kind of pushing me to try to think about my artwork as being trying to abstract things from what we would traditionally expect from clay. And Margaret was a person who just was very influential in encouraging me to try pinching at that time when I was starting to make pinch pots. There were very few people who were doing it, and it felt to me that it was not anything that was elegant or beautiful. And Margaret was very wonderful about encouraging me to say, like, you can find your own voice in this, and you don't have to be beholden to kind of what had been happening, or that I had not seen or had happened prior to me working in this way. And then Warren Mckenzie was just such a legacy of Minnesota pottery. The summer after my in between my senior and junior years of college, I actually was a resident at the Archie Bray Foundation, which is a ceramics art center out in Montana. And it was a really incredible opportunity. And it was the first time I got to make work that was just for me. It wasn't for an assignment. And I was able to be around people from all over the world and see these influences and kind of start to figure out my own voice in this. After the Archie Bray, went back and finished school, and then I got a fellowship and went to Australia and really found some wonderful influence there from a woman named Janet DeBoos who taught at the school. And also, I should also add that Lucy Ree was another potter who was highly influential to me with just her simplicity of form. And this is a piece of hers on the right. So this is some work that I kind of was starting to develop into at this time. They were very simplistic forms and very minimalist, using these soft matte white glazes. When I was at the Archie Bray Foundation, again, I went back there for a second time for a longer term. I was there for 2 years. And at that time, I really started looking at the way objects connected to one another, that they connected to other objects within a set. So something like up on the upper left, this is a breakfast set for 2, or this lemonade set on the bottom right. And just also this idea that objects can operate as these props for relationships and kind of stand-ins for how things connect. So this double-sided container, thinking about like 2 people using it, and just a simple act of a bowl where multiple people are kind of taking objects out of there. I went to the Archie Bray Foundation and then found my way back in Minnesota and was working there out of a studio space, and honestly felt at this time, because I had been making pots in high school actually, and I had been working for 4 years in undergraduate, and then I had about 3 years after that of making pots on my own, and I just honestly felt a little bit unsettled about where I was going and what I was doing. And I decided to apply for graduate school, and I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder. And when I went there, I decided I was okay if I never made pots. And so I started really exploring more of this idea of these relationships between people. And really that was what the pots were for me, is this idea of interconnectedness. And I started thinking of objects as metaphor, because pots were also a metaphor for these things of community and relationships. So I started kind of making these still life out of porcelain. So this one was titled "Come Again When Spring Comes," 4 pears, cabbage leaves, and blossom. This is a piece on the left titled "Open to You," 6 pea pods and 9 peas. And this was based off of this kind of old wives' tale that if a girl was shelling a pea pod and they had a pea that had more than 9 peas in it, that the person who walked through the door after that was the person who you were meant to marry. So some of it was this idea of based on these stories. And then this other one on the right is titled "Please Tell Me Again, Peppers and Seeds." At this time, I was also looking at one of the Medici family painters, Giovanna Garzoni, and I was really enamored with the way she painted. I really loved these soft forms. They were always a little bit quirky. And I started thinking a lot of my painting, or my pinching like painting. So each of my fingers was like making a brush stroke. And I began stepping away from how I was perceiving my work, and it gave me a lot of freedom to try new things. I tried to be open to new ideas and new projects and looking outside of clay to work. And so I just expanded, trying to do some other things. So this is a series of lungs that I did. And so I was thinking about this duality between objects. And so this was part of a lung series. And it was this idea of the beautiful object and the thing that captures it. And then that moved into these paper cuts that I was doing that were these large scale, almost like wall quilts. This is a larger piece from my thesis show, which was titled "Clouds." Come Again When Spring Comes. And these were these large clouds that were on the wall. And they were very much influenced by this landscape and this idea of how we think about time how we think about, how we remember things, how we think about things, how we can become entranced in a moment. And then it was also coupled with these water paintings. So this is an installation view of these drawings. These are quite large in size. This is the one on the right is titled Vases, and this is from this fountain series of drawings. So this was idea of this unconscious consciousness. How do we look at something but look beyond that something? How do we look at something and how does it trigger these memories of that space that we had been? So it's kind of always thinking about like not the object, but what does this object stand in for? After I was done with graduate school, I feel it was kind of a funny thing where all of a sudden I switched back to making pots again. And I felt like it was just this very comforting thing. I felt like grad school had been a time that I really stretched myself and started thinking about my work differently. But ultimately, when I was done, I felt like I needed to have some grounding space. So I went back to making some pots, and I did this for about a year or 2 years. And then I got a residency in Germany, and I went to go work at the Zentrum for Ceramics in Berlin. And this was a body of work that I did there. Some of it came out of at this space. I was the only person working there, and it was in East Berlin. And my German now is very rusty. At that time, it was much better. But I would in East Berlin, most of the people there at that time, their second language wasn't English; it was Russian. So whereas in most of Germany, you would find that they would speak English very fluently. In this particular neighborhood I was staying, it was not necessarily the case. And so language was this really interesting thing. So I started making these speech balloons, because even though I could understand what people were saying, a lot of times I had a difficult time communicating to them. And so these were some pieces that I was making where I would go around and hand people these balloons and ask them in German, could you take a picture of this with me? And so it was this idea about hearing people speak, but not knowing what they were saying. So, like I said, I've always been interested in making vessels for use, but really, I think at this time too, what I was really interested in this idea of touch. And all of my work has been made by pinching these forms into shape. And I was thinking of how to abstract these objects familiar to us, like a bowl. So kind of going back to these roots of what I had been thinking about in undergrad with Mark Ferris. How can you create these unusual things out of a familiar space? And this is a vase. So by making objects, I wanted to show, again, this presence of another person. And I feel like when you're working with a wheel, that can be a little lost. Like this, using a wheel, this motion of spinning and the tools using it, remove the finger marks of the maker. And I really still wanted my presence to be known. And also within this notion of touch is how things relate to one another. So again, looking back to this earlier work that I've been making at the Archie Bray Foundation, familiar objects can have this sense of connection or belonging to one another or to us. And so again, I was kind of re-exploring these idea of sugar and cream sets, breakfast sets. And every year there's a national ceramics conference called NCECA. And for many years, there was a gallery named Santa Fe Clay that had this exhibition of dinnerware sets, inviting artists to make place settings for a larger table and that they would display, kind of like the Judy Chicago, the dinnerware set that she had made. And so I was thinking about this idea of connectivity. And usually I had shown a dinnerware set from work I'd already made, but in 2011, I experienced my first of 4 miscarriages. And I wanted to figure out how I could express ideas of family and belonging within the work that I was making. And so I utilized the way that objects nested and rested on one another, fitting into specific places and giving certain pieces the position of belonging or absence when they weren't there. And it was heavily rooted in this idea of family and connectivity between objects that serve different functions. So how do we all fit together? Not all of my work revolved around these personal, kind of emotionally charged sets at this time, but I was dabbling with how to have a conversation with that within the realm of my vessels. In 2013, I was asked to be a part of an exhibition on disaster. And I agreed to participate with the caveat of like wanting to talk about bodily disaster. And at this point, I'd been poked and prodded along through this attempted IVF in order to potentially have to get pregnant. And we had a bunch of testing done, and we concluded from the doctors that my internal reproductive organs had been damaged for unknown reasons so badly that the doctor had assumed I had undergone some sort of radiation treatment as a child, which I had never done. And that was an immense feeling of disappointment and heartache. And so out of that, I made this series titled Breakfast Set for a Childless Mother. And it was always really difficult to make that work because not only was it emotionally draining, but when the conversations did open up a dialogue about pregnancy loss, many people were really insensitive to it. And so sometimes I felt that it was just better off not to be discussed. And so I continued to show work, but a lot of times on a much less personal manner. And this is just a breakfast set that I made for the Clay Studio in Philly with this, but still kind of talking about this idea of shared space and intimacy between people, but in a more kind of traditional sense. In the spring of 2014, I was asked to work for 6 weeks as a visiting artist at the University of Montana, Missoula. And it was really a great time of head clearing space. I got to explore work I'd been interested in pursuing, but not had the time to focus on. In making my vessels, I wanted people to see them differently. And I wanted them to see that intimacy of the finger mark and the presence of another person. And the art world in many ways has forgone touch as a means of communication, but with pots, we're able to be active participants in this communication through use. And so we're able to think the way, we're able to think through the way that we touch objects. Another artist who's always been very inspiring to me is the artist Eugene Von Branchenheim, who was an outsider artist who lived in Milwaukee. And his work is very much about the physicality of the hand and thinking about how we engage with material. And this is a piece that I made at that time. So I left Montana in June of 2014. And in September, I found out that I was pregnant again for the 5th time. And here we go. So here we had a very happy, wonderful little boy. His name is Luke. So after 9 months of stress and worry and grief, I had this wonderful little guy. And because this was such an unexpected surprise, I felt the need to celebrate this milestone in some way. So when I worked when I teach at the Art Institute, the museum is just on the other side of our building. And so oftentimes I would go to the museum and there was this Greek crater, which is the piece on the left, that I would walk by nearly every day. There's a piece on the right, which is also from this museum in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin that I saw when I visited in 2009 and really enjoyed that piece quite a bit. And I kept thinking about these Greek pieces and how at the original Olympics, some amphora were used as trophies and they were filled with these olives and they were to be given as prizes to athletes. And I kind of thought about this epic journey that I had been on, and I felt like I had gone through this marathon of sorts, and my body and emotional well-being had been pushed to the brink. And I wanted to make an object that was celebrating that accomplishment. I wanted to look to historical forms to influence the work that I make. So simply beyond their form, I wanted to kind of look back to the original significance to them, to their exuberance and to their triumph. I wanted to look at how a Greek vessel can have a new conversation with a different type of physical or mental exertion. As I've worked with pots over the past 20 years, I really try to question myself as to their role. How do they interact with us? How can they live in our lives in a way that reaches beyond utility? What is the manner in which I can connect with another person, where our hands can touch in an indirect way, where my story can overlap with your story? I think about touch as time. Making pinch pots are slow, they're laborious, nothing is unintentional. I want to think about how I can communicate to the user or the participant and engage them in a conversation about waiting and about patience. And how can I think about mark making that goes beyond my fingers, leaving an impression in the clay, that each line is a second and that it's a moment preserved. Thinking about marks that have varying cultural significance. how a plus sign can be the symbol for a positive outcome on a pregnancy test, or the symbol of a kiss written on a love note, or even just the symbol of the Red Cross. At one point, I was asked to participate in a show that was about invisible illness. Most people in the show were talking about mental illness or other illnesses, physical illnesses that they had gone through, but I wanted to talk about infertility, and I really struggled with how to talk about it. And I started making these mugs at this time called tally mugs, which I've drawn lines on them marking the passage of time. So time waiting for something to begin and time waiting for something to end. I often thought about the pregnancies that had not been successful, and I wanted to figure out how to commemorate them. And for some reason, I kept thinking about these Renaissance paintings of women and people adorned with halos, representing them as secret objects, and that they were something set apart. So in spite of those pregnancies not coming to fruition, they were still a real experience for me. And I began to make what I called halo vases. So they were with this notion of memorializing that moment of time, marking it as a sacred time. Vessels are means of private communication, as well as means for collective communication. We can participate with them, we can engage. The act of putting flowers in a space isn't simply about making a room beautiful, but it can be about remembrance. They can speak to our lives and our rituals that might point to a specific moment that we want to remember or perhaps forget. Vessels can create a means of memorializing a period of time, a space, a person. Vessels can speak to fullness or to vacancy. This is a body of work I was exploring pre-COVID, and I have to put that caveat because I feel like since COVID, my studio practice has totally shifted immensely, as I'm sure a lot of people's lives have obviously shifted in this time. So this was kind of like the last point, but then there's other work that I've been working on, and I'll kind of get into that. But this was this last one of the kind of more fully thought out, I shouldn't say fully thought out, but bodies of work that I was doing. So this was a body of work that I was trying to use this circle to find connections to other shapes and histories. So this idea of a haith or an aureole becoming a wreath, that it becomes a cosmic movement of light and how forms can interconnect and that they can speak to one another in form and significance, that they can become a stellar being bursting into brightness just before collapsing in, that a halo of light emboldens a sky, can be a last gasp. Objects can be twins, a wreath and a wraith, a halo and a whole. One is present, the other is past. One is seen and celebrated, and the other is a mist and a breath. And these objects can be the moments that signal where life begins and ends. So using the caveat of that was pre-COVID, I kind of feel like I a lot of times find myself more recently flip-flopping between this idea of sculpture and utility. I oftentimes feel like my brain is working between these two worlds. So this is a body of work that I was making after that. During COVID is kind of a means of just thinking through life and as things were going through that time frame. And I feel like the vase is just a really remarkable object that can speak to so many of these things. And I feel more and more that that is the object that I find myself drawn to talk about these ideas of abstraction within our community, within how we relate to one another. These are more objects for use. And again, I'm still seeing for me in these works that I'm really drawn to this notion of touch. And at this point, I've decided to switch the way that the objects that I make are created. Whereas before, the functional objects had glaze that covered the entire surface, I have found myself more and more drawn to objects with the actual surface of the clay is revealed in these little bits, that the tactility, that connectedness between my hand and the vessel and your hand and the vessel connect more without having any sort of barrier between them. Most recently, these were some vases that I was working on as I've been thinking about the vase as this really wonderful way of talking about abstraction. This is a piece that I've titled Divided Heart Vase. On the left, we have the Weeping Willow vase, and on the right, it's the vase of one-sided weeping. And I've always loved the vessel and its ability to have purpose, and that this vessel can transcend use. And like I was saying, I find myself more and more interested in vessel as metaphor than as functional object. Because for more than 20 years, I've been making pots. And early on, in images that I did not show, I felt like there were people who would correct me, or not correct me, but they would ask me, oh, when you've worked with making pots longer, your throwing will get better. And that was always really frustrating because I wasn't throwing them on a wheel, I was hand building them. And so I decided I had to make my work as perfect as possible, trying to make everything look and feel as tightly constructed as possible. So for many years, I would strive for this perfection in my work and also, frankly, in myself. I grew up in a very religious household, and this idea of perfection was the goal. It was this idea of being like Christ, this perfect being. Don't show the seams, don't show your cracks. And I feel like my pinch pots did become very symmetrical, and they did mimic those perfectly thrown pots. This is another one of my most recent pieces. As I think about historical work, one of the traditions that I've always been aware of is these Japanese oribe ware vessels. And these, I've never found any sort of connection to them in the sense of within my own work, but recently I've really been drawn to them. So these oribe pots live in this liminal space between the controlled and the unpredictable, and how glaze poured over at random and then a structured ornamentation fills the blank spaces has become really intriguing to me. And over the past years, I've tried to work out this idea of being in control and out of control in my work. And as a functional potter, a chip or a crack is a flaw that can't be tolerated. It is of no use any longer, and it has to be discarded and remade. So this next group of work that I've started making is out of a body of work that I'm calling Schmerzlichkeit, which is this German word that I've made up. And essentially, it's kind of this combination of words. There's a word in German called Gemütlichkeit, which is the untranslatable word for comfort or goodwill or friendliness, while the word schmerzlich in German is pain, bitter, grievous, or agonizing. And so it's kind of trying to create this hybrid between these words of Gemütlichkeit and Schmerzlichkeit, idea of that, this idea of brokenness and the painfulness of marks that they leave. So it's kind of almost the opposite of this idea of kintsugi, which is this Japanese ware that I feel like is very well known in pop culture now, where you have this thing that's broken, it gets remended in this very beautiful way. And so I've started taking objects in my home or in my studio that I've broken and that I would typically discard, and I've actually used them to remake them. And so in kintsugi, it's this idea that the repair is beautiful. It's something to be admired. It's something to add beauty to the object, and that it becomes more beautiful. It's this mark of time and this moment that is to be treasured, not rejected. But I think about what happens when brokenness is simply brokenness, that things are awful and ugly, and that there's no way of repairing it in a way that makes sense. And so this work is kind of an exploration of these vessels that act as almost apologies and confessions and admissions of my shortcomings. So a lot of these are titled for the person whose object they are. So this is, Can You Forgive Me, Anna? And then Don't Be Mad, Gwen. And then these are the last two pieces I'm going to show today. So this one on the left is titled, I Really Didn't Mean for It to Come Out That Way. And then on the right, I have the object I'm sorry, it just slipped out. And they're kind of meant as dualities in this world of kind of funny and cheeky, but also a bit on the confessional side. This is a body of work that I'm continuing to explore, and I really look forward over the next year or so to see how this work can move forward and explore these ideas of brokenness within the vessel and frankly within myself. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much for being with us today, Emily, and for taking the time to talk about your work. We also have a little bit of time for questions that students have submitted beforehand. The first question is, when you begin creating a new piece, what considerations come into play regarding the relationship between the three-dimensional form and two-dimensional surface design?
It's a great question. One of the things that I consider when I'm creating a form and that surface design is I really like to think about the unexpected. I like to think about a surprise. So when I'm creating a cup or a vessel, I might do something where the form or the surface decoration on one side almost mimics the other, but you would almost never find that the two would be a mirror image of each other. There's usually one little thing that kind of shifts just enough. So that way it's a little bit unexpected. I really always feel like that's important in the work to challenge whoever is looking at it to kind of look for those differences in it. I also think about how does their eye move around that piece in thinking about like, is this line going to stop here and not help them to anticipate like how this shape is moving around the corner? Or with a vase, how does this line arc down and how does that connect to whatever might be happening on the surface? I try to think about all those things and how your eye moves around this shape. And I also like to think about like with the glazed surface, very rarely do I ever use a glossy glaze, only because for me, one of the most important things about the way that I make work is the tactility of it. And oftentimes when you use a glossy glaze, it obliterates all those pinch marks. So I always try to find surfaces that highlight the pinch marks, that highlight that fingerprint, because that's so important in the work. And so therefore, like I've always been working with pretty matte glazes, but this idea of removing the glaze altogether has become really important. And I feel like it has changed my work, because a lot of times when I would be making pieces in my studio and I'd have them sitting there with slip or even just as green, where I was like, oh, it looks so good now. And then I'd add the glaze and I'm like, oh, that's not quite what I was wanting it to be. And I was like, well, what happens if I just stop using glaze? And like, how can I just eliminate that as a part of the process? And so that's why I started kind of removing that, because I felt like inhibiting this connection between my hand and the work. And also just that all this time that I had put into pinching that surface and making that mark so noticeable, it all of a sudden was gone. So those are some of the things that I think about in relationship to that.
When you create a piece, do you think of who will be using it? And if yes, how does it influence your design decisions?
That's also a really great question. And I think about it in terms of like, who is going to be using this piece, kind of more or less in terms of like, how would I use this piece? So very seldom do I actually think about like another person in terms of like a very specific person. But I think about like, how would I use this piece? Is this a piece that I would use in my home? Where is this? How would I interact with this? Because I can't speak to how anybody else would use. That's being very speculative and putting a lot of presumptions on other people. And, you know, I can only speak for my own self and my own experience and how I like forms to fit in my hand, because which has sometimes creates its own sense of problems. Like if I make a cup and I'm like, oh, this fits so nicely in my hand and this fits in my finger. Like I remember one time my studio mate, Sean O'Connell, I was making these cups and he came over and tested when I was like, your fingers are too small. I can hardly get my fingers in here. And I was like, oh, oops, sorry. I guess my cups are just not made for big fingered people. And part of me is like, I have no apologies about that, because sometimes, it's like I could make cups for all sorts of people, or the ways that other people could use it. But it's like there's such an enormity to who could be using it, how could they using it. It's like I just can't keep up with that. One time, I had been part of a group called, or I'm part of a group called Objective Clay, and at one point we were discussing like what types of objects you make, and kind of the range specifically within functional work that everybody made. And Brian Hopkins was talking about, I can't remember which form. It was like butter dishes or something. And I was like, I don't make those anymore. I used to love making covered containers, and then I stopped making them. And it was for a very intentional reason, because I don't like clutter, and I hate collecting things just for the sake of collecting. And I said, I'm not going to make lidded containers, because people who have containers, they use them as they actually serve no purpose, and I don't want to support that. And so I stopped making them. And there's like certain things where I just feel like it is very much my own point of view that I'm just like, yeah, I'm just not doing that anymore. So I kind of feel like a lot of the work that I make is me kind of projecting my own kind of philosophy on certain things, which is probably not a very good from a business standpoint. My husband laments me sometimes for the ways that I choose or to make or not to make things. But yeah, that's kind of how I think about it. And so I would say, I just think about my life and what are the pieces that I find interesting and fascinating, and kind of work backwards from there.
Thank you. Okay, and the next question is, what advice do you have for someone interested in having a career in making functional vessels?
That is also a great question. I get asked that question a lot teaching at the Art Institute. I feel like there's not really a great answer for that question, because I think there are so many different paths that people can go into with that career path. So to say this is the way to do it, or this is not the way to do it, this is the best practice, this is not the best practice, I feel like is not a helpful thing, because there's such a wide variety of ways to go about doing that. You could go the realm of doing more designed objects where you're making them in mass production, like really making them in mass production. Like I think about somebody like Molly Hatch. We went to grad school together, and Molly decided to make designed objects where she's selling them at Macy's and Anthropology and all sorts of places like that. So you can go that route. There's people I know that do things where it's like they're thrown vessels, and they're doing them at in limited quantity, or somebody like Brian Ganuski, who's making these thrown pots where they're more sculpture than they are functional vessels. You have people like Brian Hopkins, who is making beautiful hand-built ware, and Brian sells his work at a lot of different craft shows. And yeah, I mean, there's just so many different ways to kind of move forward. And then there's people like Warren Mckenzie, which is who I grew up seeing, right? They were making functional pots. They had a little studio in the backyard, and it was attached to like where he worked, and he would dump them out there. And me as a silly 18-year-old would go there at midnight with my buddies who were interested in making pots, and we'd go wax poetic about these Minge, Minnesota pots that were there. And it just, everybody has a different path in that. The one thing that I do think is really important is sticking together with other friends. I think that that is the one way that I see people really have support, is when you leave school. I think it's a very different world, and I think it can feel very scary working in clay, not just being a potter, but working as a clay artist. There's a lot of expensive tools you have to have: kilns, potentially a wheel, glazed materials, a lab, photography equipment to document the work. Like there's just a lot of upfront cost. And I always feel like if you can work it out where you've got like 2 people, 3 people that you're like, let's all do this together. Let's go set up a studio. You can share the cost of that. It's also a really great motivator when there's another person who's going to be at the studio, or can say like, hey, let's go to the studio and do this on Friday or Saturday or whatnot. I think that idea of working together is an immense support structure, because I feel like ceramics in many ways since the beginning of time has kind of been a communal event, right? Like firing pots together in these old communal kilns, going and harvesting clay, all this stuff. And I still feel like today, the best way to be a potter is to still be working in a community versus being like the lone potter. And so I would say like success can look in a really wide variety of ways, but I do feel like the thing that is going to ensure that you kind of can keep going on that path is just to have a community that helps support you, and with whatever way that goes.
Thank you. Another question is, how does your teaching influence your art making and vice versa?
I actually think about that question probably more than I think about anything else, to be quite frank. This semester is my first semester. I'm actually not teaching a studio class. I'm teaching 2 lecture-based classes, and one of them is an art history class. It's history of ceramics. And I always feel like my students, in watching them push, so as far as like, how do my students influence me? I always feel like it's way more, I feel like I influence, like I get way more out of my students than they probably ever get out of me. But just this idea of how they challenge themselves, how we kind of problem solve through things, and thinking about, oh, you ran into this bump in the road. How can we fix this? Like, what are some ways we can kind of go around this thing that you're trying to do? Oh, you want to make this really big vessel, but you want it to hang off a wooden board, but you don't want to use any nails. Well, let's think about how we can make this happen. And it's questions that I would never even come across in my work. And I feel like those are the things where it's like, oh, wow, if I wanted to try that in my work, I guess I could try that, And so I always feel like I see them trying these really new, crazy, interesting things. And then it kind of pushes me to try more crazy, interesting things in my work. But this art history class that I'm teaching right now, I feel like has been immensely insightful. And I feel like I've been learning so much about like really deep dives into ceramic history and things that it's like, I kind of knew the periphery of certain things, but I feel like now it's like, wow, all this stuff is kind of really coming together in a really significant way that I guess I never really quite knew fully. And it's just been kind of a little bit mind blowing for me, to be quite honest. And I enjoy it. I've always kind of been a little bit of a traditionalist nerd, and me, because of growing up in a pottery based school that was so deep into functional vessels. But also part of what I've been trying to do at the Art Institute while teaching over the past 7 years is we have this museum at our fingertips. And I felt like when I was growing up, I was very much trained in the way of like Bernard Leach, of like Chinese pots are kind of the best, Japanese pots are the best. And, there's also some of this stuff happening in England that's really great. And kind of other than that, nobody else exists. And so I started teaching a class maybe 5 years ago that was where we would go to the museum like every other week and look at work. And I very intentionally kind of almost avoided the Asian art section, because I felt like I never learned about African pots when I was in school, or, Mexican pots or South American pots and all these things, or Iranian pots. And so it was very much about like almost filling in the gaps of my own education and learning about these histories. And so now I've actually, as I'm teaching this class, I'm like, oh gosh, I got to brush up on my skills or my knowledge of Chinese ceramics, because I've kind of bypassed it for the past 5 years and been really avidly learning about all these other areas. So that's like one of the ways that my teaching really influences my work, and feeling like I see more and more, specifically with this idea of the vase as metaphor, how that has been kind of this theme that has been constantly, I feel like it's been there from the beginning, that I look at things like, Greek vases and just all sorts of things, all these different ways that the vase has been used throughout history as not necessarily a functional object, but as this way to tell a story. And I feel like that is probably the thing that I'm most intrigued by. So it's like, how can I use that history and how they've been doing it to kind of push my own work forward?
Thank you, Emily, so much for being with us today.
Thank you.
I want to thank everyone who joined us, and I hope you can join us for the next Visiting Artists Series event, a lecture by Vladimir Radutny on March 2nd at 11 a.m. I look forward to seeing you then.